Afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining me. My name is Nicola Lacetera. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. And today I'm going to talk about the economics and ethics of paying plasma donors. First of all, I hope all of you are safe and fine. And let me express my sympathy for any of you or people you know were directly or indirectly affected by the COVID-19 outbreak and pandemic. I also want to acknowledge that for thousands of years, the land where I work and live has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently of the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this land is home to many indigenous people, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. Turns out that we are in the middle of National Blood Donor Week in Canada. It's a week where we celebrate blood donors and advocate for people to donate blood. And the week actually culminates on this Sunday, June 14, in the World Blood Donor Day, which is an initiative of the World Health Organization. So talking about how to motivate and the ethics and economics behind it, blood donations and the donation of blood parts, blood components, turns out to be very timely right now. Why should we talk about these issues? Why should we care? Well, it turns out that for many medical conditions, treatments come from human body parts, and typically not the body of the person in need for treatment, but other people who donate this part. I want to focus mostly on body fluids in this talk, and especially blood and plasma, which is the liquid part of blood. We use blood transfusions for to treat many conditions, several types of cancers, several types of blood diseases like sickle cell disease. During surgeries, many patients need, in some cases, massive blood transfusions, for example, in case of organ transplants, for the treatment of premature babies and their moms, and of course, in case of accidents where there is massive bleeding as well. Approximately 16 to 17 million units of blood are collected in the US every year, and about 1 to 2 million in Canada. There are a number of reasons why quite often, both in the developed world, but also in the, especially actually in the developing world, there is a tension between the demand and supply for blood, and we might incur the risk of shortages. So first of all, at the moment, there aren't many substitutes for blood. For human blood, for these treatments. We can only store blood for a relatively small period of time, around 42 days. A number of technical advances, especially in organ transplantations and the aging of the population, are increasing the demand of blood for transfusions, although other advances, eventually maybe artificial blood, might actually reduce the need of human blood. And also, very often we think of blood transfusions as occurring in case of accidents, so relatively random, if you want, episodes. But most of the use of blood for transfusion is for predictable, chronic, stable situations, from cancers, blood diseases, surgeries, and so on. And so if the demand is pretty stable over time, the supply tends to be seasonal. When it's very cold, people don't go out and donate their blood. In the winter, during the summer, people are traveling on vacations, and so they may be less likely. And this, together to the fact that you cannot store the blood for a long time, might also increase shortage. And so there is a need to motivate more and more people to donate blood. How about plasma? So plasma, as I said, is the liquid part of blood, and it can be extracted from a whole blood donations. This is called recovered plasma, or by a procedure which is called plasmapheresis. And in this case, we talk about source plasma. This procedure, the donor gets both, the whole blood drawn, and then there is a machine basically that separates plasma from the more solid part of blood. and that part goes back into the donor system, the donor body. Plasma consists of water, salts, number of enzymes, antibodies, immunoglobulins, several proteins such as albumin, and several functions in the body, for example, blood clotting, and it fights a number of infections. Plasma can be used either through direct transfusion into a patient, or also processed and used for the production of several therapies through procedures called fractionations. And there are a number of diseases, especially chronic diseases, for which plasma is extremely useful. In fact, some people call it the gift of life, to give plasma. Primary immunodeficiency, hemophilia, genetic lung disease, the treatment of trauma, for burns, shock, for example. And also it's used to treat infections for people, for example, exposed to tetanus-prone wounds in case they're not vaccinated for tetanus. In fact, the first Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine went to Emil Behring about 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago. And he received the prize because of his work demonstrated that plasma therapies, or serum therapies as they're also called, could be used for the treatment of diphtheria. Producing all these plasma-based therapies required a large number of plasma donations. And this is where the tension in the case of plasma between demand and supply emerges mostly. Just to give an example, for the treatment of one patient with hemophilia in a year, a single patient, we need 1,200 plasma donations. So you can imagine how large the quantities are on a global level. Some of these therapies are also quite expensive. Therapies, based on plasma product might reach, for example, $200,000 of expenses of cost per year. And this, if we put it all together, builds, a big industry. Some estimates define the global plasma market just for fractionation, so processed plasma for drugs, to be about $70 billion currently, with the rapid growth that might bring it to about 30 billion in 7 or 8 years from now. Recently, there has been also an increasing attention about the role and the use of plasma because of the COVID-19 outbreaks, because the plasma is rich with antibodies. There is a belief that it can be used to treat patients who contracted COVID-19. There were already some attempts a few years ago during the Ebola virus outbreaks, 2013 to 2016, and there had been attempts both by the direct use of convalescent plasma, so the plasma of patients who recovered from the disease, both through direct transfusion, but also with the production, for example, of the isolation of hyperimmune immunoglobulins. We still don't have those kind of studies that researchers like the most. Large sample randomized controlled trials. There have been small sample studies that seem quite promising also for the treatment of COVID-19. And that's why several patients who contracted COVID-19 and thankfully recovered are now donating their plasma quite regularly. You need several donations, and several organizations, hospitals, and so on set up infrastructure to essentially store and freeze this plasma for potential use and for processing. There is one major difference across countries or even jurisdictions within a country in the allocation and especially the procurement of plasma. One main difference is that in some countries, donors, those who give their plasma or supply their plasma, are compensated for each of their donation. And there is a for-profit plasma collection and processing industry. Whereas many other countries prohibit payments to donors and also do not have a sort of private industry or for-profit business industry for the collection and the processing of plasma. Countries that allow for payments include the United States in particular, but also other countries such as the Czech Republic or Austria, but the majority of other countries actually prohibit any form of payment, including Canada, as far as the main provinces go, such as Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, Alberta as well. It is allowed to pay donors and to set up for-profit plasma centers, for example, in Saskatchewan. It is Canadian Blood Services and Hema-Quebec, who are the organization in Canada who collect plasma. There is a long history of opposition to paying plasma as well as blood donors around the world. Perhaps the origin of this approach, this view, comes from a book that Richard Titmuss, a social scientist in the UK, published in the early 1970s, where he said that sure, we might think of payments as a way to motivate donors to donate more, or more donors to donate, so in a way to sort of solve imbalances between demand and supply. But hey, let's be very careful, because actually this form of procurement can backfire, and can backfire for a number of reasons. First of all, what are the motivations for people to donate their blood? Maybe they do it precisely because it's free, because it's an act of voluntary giving. And as soon as you put a price on it, actually people's motivations might change. They might even resent it. And so, for example, move their willingness to help, their charitable activities to other goals, to other activities altogether. So actually, there may be what social scientists call a motivational crowding out. Another issue might have to do with what sometimes we call adverse selection. So the question here that Titmuss advanced was, who will be the people who would be willing to donate for compensation? Well, it may be people who are more marginalized, who are more in need of immediate money. And these could be people who are more likely to have contracted certain diseases, of having had certain behavior that might affect the quality or the safety of their blood. The issue at the time was especially with hepatitis and the possibility to transmit it to recipients of blood or plasma. But there was also in Titmuss' work a series of sort of deeper, more fundamental reasons that have to do with ethics and the social support of certain markets. By paying donor, we might actually exploit these donors, take advantage of them, or the presence of a payment might sort of generate some sort of undue influence or coercion, especially on those more marginalized or in lower socio-economic strata of the population. There might be also a risk of commodifying the human body or part of it, to put a price of something that we consider sacred. And this might lead to a slippery slope in which we give up certain fundamental values that hold societies together, and this might definitely not be worthwhile. The shadow of Titmuss' views loomed really large in the legislations of many countries for decades, and affected the way in many countries today the procurement and allocation of blood and plasma works. In the case of Canada, from where I'm talking, of course, there were also some events in the 80s that sort of increased the attention toward the safety, in particular, of plasma. There was a major scandal with about 2,000 recipients of blood and blood products who contracted HIV in the early 80s because the blood or the blood parts were contaminated, and another about 30,000 transfusion recipients actually were infected with hepatitis C as a consequence of their transfusion. Again, in the 80s, and many of these people actually had very negative health consequences, including death. There was a commission that was established in Canada, led by Justice Horace Crever, and the commission was very articulated. There is a very nice book by the health journalist André Picard called "The Gift of Death," sort of a way to paraphrase the view of donating blood and plasma as being the gift of life, that goes through the detail of what this commission did. And there were many reasons, but for some reason, the public attention focused a lot on one of the recommendations of the commission in the late 90s about banning payment to donors, because that might increase the risk, the safety risk of the blood. And so laws banning for-profit plasma centers and payment to donors were enacted in many provinces. Recently, there have been also debates at the federal level to extend this ban to the whole country. The debate is still there. For example, in Alberta, a member of the Legislative Assembly may soon propose to repeal what is called the Voluntary Blood Donations Act, which prohibit payments and the establishment of for-profit centers. It turns out, though, that there is also a view that is very concerned about the potential imbalance between the demand and supply of plasma in particular, and is actually advocating strongly to reconsider the possibility of paying donors in Canada and elsewhere around the world. There are a number of ethicists, economists, observers, and so on, pointing out that the evidence, for example, of motivational crowding out, the idea that if you compensate donors, they will actually be less likely to donate because somewhat there will be a contrast of motivations, is really not borne out in the data. There is some evidence from blood donations in particular, some of which I, together with a number of co-authors, have produced through a number of experiments and retrospective data analysis, showing that actually providing certain forms of rewards, going from gift cards, vouchers, but also allowing for a day off work, which is what happens, for example, in Italy, actually leads to more blood donations. We don't have that kind of sort of randomized control-like evidence for plasma thus far, but to the extent that there is a similarity between donating blood and plasma, then one might make some inferences. It's also the case, and this is not, in a sense, strongly scientific evidence, that those countries that have a surplus of plasma, especially for fractionation use, and actually are exporting plasma to many other countries in the world, including countries who prohibit payments, are those who actually allow payments. The US, some people call the US the Saudi Arabia of plasma because it's actually a net exporter, and many countries, including Canada, depend strongly on the US. For example, in Canada, about 80 to 85% of the immunoglobulin used come from paid plasma donors in the US. We are around 40 to 45% for Australia, just to give another example. Of course, we cannot infer directly that paying generates a surplus, but it's pretty compelling evidence that perhaps by paying, more donors are actually have an intention to donate. The safety argument, of course, is one that concerns most people. And those who are actually in favor of payment, or at least in favor of considering payment, point out that from for example, the Crever commissions and what happened in Canada in particular, it's really unclear whether the problem was really payments as opposed to, for example, the lack of proper screening and even a lack of the use of certain technologies for screening potential infections that were actually still available, for example, in the 80s. It's also the case that in the last 20 years, the manufacturing process for plasma product has made so much progress that there haven't been any cases of contamination. There is a very, very high ability to inactivate a number of contaminants. For example, there have been a few cases of contagions through blood donations for the West Nile virus, but no cases at all for plasma, especially processed plasma used for fractionation. So new technologies have an ability to eliminate a high number of pathogens to an extent that makes the safety issue maybe less compelling. And in fact, as I said, many countries rely on plasma produced in the US, where donors are paid, because they sort of trust and they're confident that those procedures to isolate and inactivate contaminants and pathogens are actually extremely effective. As for the ethical issues, those who propose to consider payments point out that it's not so clear that paying donors is actually exploitative. At the end of the day, they receive payment. The procedure to collect plasma, takes time and it's a little painful. So maybe it requires some form of compensation. But at the end of the day, it's not too invasive, according to these people, as compared to the payments, which go from $30 to $50, more or less. And at the end of the day, when we talk about commodification of the human body or activities around, the collection of body parts for medical use, everybody's paid: the doctors, medical staff, nurses, and so on. So why not also compensate those who actually provide the raw material, the blood? And even sort of going a little further, to the extent that developed countries have a moral duty to support and help countries who are more in need, whose medical system, healthcare system is less developed, less advanced, maybe also have the moral duty to collect as much plasma as possible in order to help also countries where this is more difficult to do. And perhaps, given the use of plasma to address certain infectious diseases, maybe this, plasma is even a strategic product. So guaranteeing a national supply might actually be a security issue for a country. Together with Mario Machis, we actually decided to move beyond the opinion of, if you want, an elite of policymakers, ethicists, and economists, and go and ask people what they think about paying plasma donors. And we did in Canada, a country that, as I said, prohibit payments almost everywhere. And we ran a survey on a representative sample of about 900 people, and we actually asked them what they thought about legalizing payments. And about 3/4 of them, around 75%, showed support to introduce payments for donors. And the main reason we also asked, why there were support, was that this would guarantee a higher domestic supply. So there is a sense that more supply is good and protects the country better. Interestingly, about 25% who showed opposition had different motives, and they had to do with ethical issues. So people believed that paying plasma donors would be in contrast with the main sort of fundamental values of Canadian society. And they also expressed concern for safety, although perhaps this is an issue of misinformation, because, as I said, the technology now in place are such that there is no difference whatsoever in the risk of plasma coming from paid or unpaid donor. In fact, we also asked those who were against payment whether they would change their mind in case there was a shortage, a supply shortage of plasma, sorry, in Canada. And actually, half of them said that in that case they would be in favor of paying donor to increase supply. So overall, if we sum up the about 75% in favor and the 12 to 13% who would change their mind from being against to being in favor, it looks as though most Canadians adopt a consequentialist view regarding paying plasma donors. So yes, there may be some sort of moral dilemmas to solve, some ethical issues to take care of. But at the end of the day, if this allows for a higher supply, well, maybe it's worth it. Of course, there are also many other things that scholars, researchers would need to look at to figure out, the overall effect of paying plasma donors. For example, a concern that some people have is that if we pay for plasma, then people who normally donate blood might actually shift to donate only plasma for certain uses. And so there may be a net zero effect in some sense. This is plausible. Some initial evidence shows that this is not the case. Maybe we're talking about different populations, but definitely there is need for more work to understand how people substitute between different altruistic activities when some provide more benefits, more rewards than others. We also need to understand, and I think this is a very important point, we need to understand where the opposition comes from. Is it about the payments per se? Is it about the type of payment? What if instead of cash, direct cash, donors would receive gift cards or vouchers, discounts, and so on? Is it about the amount? Is it too much? Is it too little? Or maybe it's not really about payment, but is it about the organization of the industry altogether? Would we be more comfortable if the companies dealing with the collection and the processing of plasma were actually non-profit or even publicly owned company owned by the government? And this would make payments actually more acceptable than if there was, for example, a for-profit industry behind. So all these things are useful to understand what determined the social support for payments, and we still don't have that kind of information, and definitely I hope that scholars will pay attention to it. And of course, in the wake of the COVID pandemic, it would be interesting to see whether opinions, both of the general population, but also of policymakers, might actually evolve in one direction or another in response to the fact that we might experience a further increase in the demand for plasma. And so overall, we see that there is an interesting and deep debate on how to sort of set up procurement and allocation systems that address the potential shortage of plasma, but at the same time abide by some prevailing moral values in a society. And the fact that we see these different setups, arrangements in different countries, some allowing payments, some not allowing payment, even very similar countries for legal origins, tradition, culture, and so on, speaks to the fact that we are talking about delicate questions about what define a trade, a market as, to use the words of Nobel Prize winner Arrot, repugnant. That is a market that, even though it doesn't generate negative effects to others directly, society as a whole prefers to ban, to prohibit altogether. So on the one hand, we need to deal with these deep questions, but also make sure that we ask people, constituencies, what they think, what the public opinion is, the sort of public view, about different transactions, about morally charged topics. Eventually, in a representative democracy, policymakers always have the prerogative to go against the prevailing position in a population if they feel that's the best course of action. But it's always a good starting point to consider the evidence, to consider different positions, and to try to find the balance between what the evidence says, what the different views are in a society, and also, especially in case of pandemics that concern the whole world on a global level. So this is all I had to say today. Let me close by reiterate the importance of donating, not just in Blood Donor Week, on World Blood Donor Day on Sunday. I've been donating blood and plasma as well for quite a long time, but in this moment, I'm in a sort of stateless position. I used to donate in Italy, where I am from, but now, living in Canada, in North America and in Canada for a long time, I cannot donate because I lived in Europe during the bovine spongiform encephalopathy crisis, the mad cow disease. And so there is still a chance that my blood might be affected according to North American authorities. And so I'm banned from donate. And as it turns out that I cannot even donate when I go back and visit family in Italy because Italian authorities and blood plasma donor organizations are afraid that my blood might contain the West Nile virus, and which is hard, as I mentioned earlier, to isolate and neutralize in whole blood. So I cannot donate anymore, unfortunately. But if you can, if you're healthy, if you're up to it and not too needle phobic, let me leave you with this encouragement to go out and donate blood or plasma. Thank you so much.